team members. I'm Adam Barger, and on behalf of the entire student team, thank you for joining us today. So our keynote speaker today is Professor Kevin Gannon. Kevin is director of the Center for the Advancement of Faculty Excellence, or CAFE. Not bad, Kevin. Good acronym. All the ed developers remember kicking themselves for not getting that one first, but nice job. He's also a professor of history at Queen's University of Charlotte, North Carolina. In an academic career over 25 years, Kevin served as a faculty member, program director, and department chair before moving full-time into faculty development. He's the author of Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto from West Virginia University Press in 2020, and the co-editor of the forthcoming collection, The Campus Crisis Toolkit, Strategies and Solidarity for the Rest of Us from SUNY Press. His higher education writing has appeared in outlets such as Vox, CNN, and the Washington Post, and he's a regular contributor to the Chronicle of Higher Education. We are thrilled to have him with us today. Please welcome Kevin Gannon.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. What do vegan zombies eat? Great. I understand that dad jokes are kind of a theme, and as a dad, I felt sort of contractually obligated to share, so my apologies. The rest will be done. So thank you for that very kind introduction. Thanks to the staff in the center here for inviting me and facilitating my visit. It's great to see some familiar faces from other institutions in the audience as well. But let me echo Adam's things. It's, a busy time of the year. My institution, we've already graduated them, so we're all ready to enter our COLA. But it is, it's harder right now, harder than it usually is. And so I'm honored to be here in a room full of folks who have decided to intentionally dedicate the time to think deeply and to be thoughtful and considerate about this work that we do with teaching and learning. So thank you very much for being here. And I'll echo Adam's hope that it is a good and regenerative and energizing day for you. Probably help if I turn this on. It's PhD training. It's fun. But before I get started, I do want to share one fact because I think it's funnier than the dad joke. So I graduated high school in Fairfax, Virginia. I spent my last 2 years of high school there. And so when I came to apply for colleges, William & Mary was one of the colleges to which I applied. William & Mary was also one of the colleges that said no when I applied because I was a sort of indifferent/punk student. So I applied to William & Mary for early decision and got denied. I applied for regular decision and got denied. I went to James Madison University, which was a wonderful experience. But then I applied to William & Mary as one of my graduate school applications and got denied. And then when I finished my master's degree in Illinois, I applied to William & Mary to enter the PhD program in history and got denied. And then when I went on the job market for history, the form was completely smaller and grayer. I applied for a tenure track position at William & Mary and got denied. And now I'm here by invitation. So don't give up on your dreams, kids. All right. So this may be a little hard to see, but the emphasis on the image was darkness, so it actually works out pretty well. So we're going to think about a pedagogy of hope today, which I alone right off the bat sounds really counterintuitive. These are not hopeful times. We are not in a climate, both in the area immediately around us, but also radiating outwards through our nation and the world that is very conducive to hope. But I would suggest that that makes thinking about hope and acting from a radical ethic of hope. And I mean radical in the literal sense of the term. Radical comes from the root word radix, which is the same root word for radish, by the way. And I'm talking about a root level fundamental commitment to hope. And so how do we do that? How do we do that now? And so what I'm hoping that our time together this morning will do is give you a chance to think intentionally about that, to stop, to at least briefly reflect, and have the chance to consider some of the larger questions that drive our work in an intentional and thoughtful way. And so at various times here in the next few minutes, I'm going to ask you to think and jot some ideas down. So if you've got something to write with, it doesn't matter what, this is just for you. So device, pen and paper, crayon on the walls, actually probably not on the walls, this is a nice building. Whatever you feel most appropriate to capture your thoughts. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian thinker and educator, in his book, Pedagogy of Hope, conveniently titled, right, talks about hope and frames hope by conceiving of its opposite to underscore the importance of hope. When it becomes a program, Freire argued, hopelessness paralyzes us. It immobilizes us. We succumb to fatalism. And when we do that, we give up our agency, right? Things happen to us as opposed to by us or because of us. And so Freire talks about we need the strength. We need the strength that, as he implies, comes from an ethic of hope in this fierce struggle that will recreate the world. And that may sound a little overblown or overdramatic, but isn't that the work that we're about? Aren't we engaged student by student, class by class, institution by institution in recreating the world? We tell our students higher education is transformative. We tell our students that they will be different when they finish with us than they were when they started. We are recreating things. And there are a lot of ways to do that. There are some projects for recreating the world that are ongoing right now that are going to recreate in a much darker vision, to put it lightly. And so I find Freire's words particularly resonant at this point. I am hopeful not out of mere stubbornness, although that helps, but out of an existential, concrete imperative. And I must submit that all of you are too, in the sense that you're here, you're still doing this stuff. It is a particularly hectic point of the semester. There may be a pile of student papers that you're looking at and maybe saying, why am I doing this? But in reality, you are showing up for your colleagues and for your students in your community on a daily basis. And it may not seem like a very dramatic or revolutionary gesture, but you're showing up. And students are coming to college. It's important and it matters. And if it didn't matter, we wouldn't be under siege. But it only matters because we bring with us hope. And my job this morning is to help you clarify and bring sort of to the center, to the surface of your thoughts, maybe, what that ethic of hope looks like for you and where it comes from. So it's tough out there right now. Just in case you're unclear as to the metaphor that I was trying to get at here. It feels overwhelming, right? We are in the midst of what Adam Tooze calls a polycrisis. A polycrisis, Tooze said, is where, and I find this a really helpful theory to sort of conceptualize what is happening around us on a daily basis. In a polycrisis, Tooze writes, the shocks are disparate. You know, it's one damn thing after another, right? But the cumulative power of those things is even more overwhelming than the sum of its parts. It's an exponential increase in terms of the anxiety, the overwhelmingness, the disorientation. At times, it feels as if one is losing one's sense of reality. And so if you have felt gaslit, if you have looked around or read the news and said, what even is this? If you are contemplating the fact that everything seems to be not just bad, but absurdly so, you are not alone. And that's what living in a polycrisis is. And makes us question our own commitments and it makes us question our own perspectives, which have been built and honed over years. And now folks are trying to get us to throw those away. And in our own sphere of higher education, yes, it's important. Yes, it's crucial. Yes, the work we do matters. But of course, I'm not going to pretend that we don't have a shortage of what we might call wicked problems in higher education. The current mental health landscape for both us and our students is unsustainable. At a former institution, which I will not name, in the fall of 2021, or fall of 2020, excuse me, we did not go fully online that semester, which is a whole nother story. We got together for our beginning of the semester meetings, all the faculty and staff in the theater, and our provost came up to the microphone and decided he was going to address the fact that everybody was continuing, that mental health was fragile, that he understood that. And he used those words to kind of point that out, and we're all in the audience like, okay, good, he gets it, he understands. And then he said, what I would like to recommend is one of the many new wellness apps that you can find in the Apple or Google Play Store. And that should be of assistance. And then he moved on to the next thing. And I'm just sitting there like, did he just say that? We're not going to wellness app our way out of this, right? The current state of atomization and disconnection is unsustainable. And so if you are struggling trying to get discussions going in class, if you are wondering why students are not engaging in the same way with the materials or the ideas or the concepts of the applications that they used to before, if the stuff that worked before isn't working now, you're not alone. But we're also in a place that doesn't feel sustainable. Education of any variety trying to coexist with an authoritarian regime is unsustainable. You can have one, or you can have the other, but you cannot have them both. And so as we think about what it is that we dream for ourselves, for our students, and for our institutions, we need to be coldly aware that we are not the only ones doing the dreaming. And again, as Freire put it, it would be naive of us to recognize that there are not counter dreams out there. And in a period where we see efforts to, among other things, resegregate education, where we see unprecedented political interference in curricula, where we see a spate of policies that at their root are profoundly anti-student, we need to realize this is a counter dream in action. So hope. You're probably sitting there now like, this guy, hope? This guy wrote a book on hope. It sucks. It is impossible to act from an ethic of hope in any meaningful and sustainable sense if we're not honest about where it is that we stand. If we're going to lie to ourselves about where we are now, then we're not going to be able to tell the truth about where it is that we want to go. And yet, so in these times, I use as a sort of touchstone the words of the writer and activist Mariam Kaba, who has said on a number of occasions, hope is a discipline, right? Hope isn't something that just sort of shows up like in a Hallmark card, right? You know, the sort of airy, gauzy, ephemeral sense. A lot of times hope is a word that gets kind of misused or stretched beyond its meaning. We say, I have hope in the future, right? Which is basically saying younger people are going to fix everything that people of my generation screwed up. So that gives me hope, right? But that's also an off-ramp, right? That lets me out of doing the work to help create that better, that more just, that more sustainable future. Hope is a discipline. You have to work at it. You have to do it. You have to show up. Even and especially at the times where you don't want to do any of it. When we looked at the psychologists who study hopeful dispositions, are there any psychologists here in the room? All right, I'm about to practice psychology without a license, so you have my apologies in advance if I screw this up. But I'm really intrigued by some of the studies, like Snyder and his colleagues, that talk about this question of how do people maintain hope? Right? What Snyder and his colleagues define hope as is an enduring disposition That is, even when the circumstances seem so adverse, that seem to mitigate so much against a hopeful disposition, there are people who cling to that in a substantial and actionable way. Why? That feels like a really important question. And what Snyder and his colleagues found in a wave of studies, there's a really interesting subfield about hope, the psychology of hope. When subjects, and that word is important too, right? To be a subject as opposed to an object. Subjects define their agency, assess their agency, but also the pathways that are related to their goals. Agency and pathways. And I want you to hold on to those couple of things because we're going to be returning to that. And so if you think about it as a mathematical equation, as the educational developers Peter Felton and Susanna McGowan did, you can frame it like this, right? Hope is the product, not just the sum. Because in a sum, you can have 0 on one side of that equation and still have a positive value, right? But if it's a product, if there's a 0 on any side of that equation, it's still 0. Agency times pathways. Neither is sufficient by itself. Both of them acting together are a foundational part of this ethic of hope. Hope is a discipline. But so is our practice. Critically reflective practice, I would submit, offers us one way, not the only way, but a helpful way and a meaningful way for us to connect with what creates our pedagogy of hope. So let's do some of it. Some of you might be familiar with this book, but if you're not, I highly recommend it. Stephen Brookfield's Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. And what Brookfield argues is that it's not enough just to be reflective, right? We hear a lot about, be a reflective teacher. That's important. But if we don't approach that reflection with lenses of criticality, we're selling ourselves short, right? So critical reflection, what kind of work does that do for us? First, and probably most importantly, and we'll have a chance to practice this in a second, it helps us engage in what Brookfield calls hunting assumptions. What are the assumptions that we bring with us into this work? How do we look at students? What do we think good learning is? What do we think engagement looks like? Who do we think our students are? What do we think are the best methods for teaching and learning? What does mastery of a discipline look like? What does retention of content look like? Who's supposed to be here and who isn't? All of those assumptions we hold answers to. We operate under a set of assumptions. Those are the lenses that we look through to view everyone and everything around us. And if we aren't able to name those assumptions, then we might be holding assumptions that are guiding us in ways that we would prefer not to go without even realizing. Critical reflection also helps us see power at work. Where are we as individuals located in this larger matrix of the university and of our society? Where does power work for us? Where does power work against us? Where do we see power at work with and among students and our colleagues? Is it work that is equitable? Is it work that advances the university's mission? Is it work that helps teaching and learning and student success? Or does power put barriers in the way of that? It helps us ground ourselves emotionally. I do a lot better when I can explain to myself the disappointments, the mistakes, the times that I was unskillful with either colleagues or students, instead of just having that be something that happened, right? If I can understand what happened and why, I can avoid those things in the future. And so I don't have to carry that with me if I don't want to. And it helps us build transparency and trust with our students, with our colleagues, and with ourselves. So this is important, and I would argue essential work. And so now I'm going to offer you an intention or an invitation, to do a little reflection. And so a caveat first. Due to time constraints, we don't really have the time to dive in the way that would make this, I think, Usually, 2 or 3 hours to kind of go through something like this would be helpful. We don't have that time. That would overrun lunch. I don't want to stand between people and food. So this will be kind of an abbreviated version of it. And so please bear that in mind when it sounds like that I'm not giving you enough time to think about this, because I'm really not. Right? This is also a type of protocol that you can adapt for student use to help students connect metacognitively with their values, their purpose, their goals, and their experiences as learners. And we'll talk a little bit about that later too. So we might as well start at the top, right? Let's get metaphysical. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this now? So the question I want you to reflect on, what is your teaching and learning story? What brought you here this morning, short and long term? And as you think about that, see if you can identify the key moments that have shaped that story, what Brookfield calls critical incidents, which sounds more medical than anything else, but we'll go with it. What has shaped that story? What are the successes, the failures, the doors opened, the doors that closed, right? What are the incidences that help shape your teaching and learning story? So I'll give you a couple minutes to jot some ideas down. Then we'll talk a little bit. One thing I will suggest is that this is actually a really interesting and helpful, for lack of a better term, kind of protocol or exercise for students. So consider in the beginning of a semester if students were asked to think about, their story as learners, right? What has been the path, or what have been the pathways that they have taken into the teaching and learning space that we're currently sharing? What were the critical incidences in that story for them? One of the moves that makes is it gets students into a place, and this is particularly true for first-year students, first-gen students, and students who are what we might call academically at risk, although I think you can make an argument that applies to all students. But it gets students thinking about themselves as learners, right? The metacognitive work that we really want them doing. And so learning is something that they are engaged in. It is not something that has merely happened to them. Or maybe it has been, right? But it's important to name that and to talk about agency and writing one's own story as well. And so as I was sort of walking around the room, a couple themes emerged from the sort of snippets of conversation that I heard. One is that many of you were talking about a particular figure, a professor or somebody else that either triggered or was an integral part of one of these critical incidents. That feels important and worth holding on to, right? For how many of you was this critical, because there can be several of these, right? For how many of you was one of these critical incidences something that we might classify as a negative? Where a door shut, where someone told you that you did not belong, right? And for how many of you is that a driver for you in your own career now as a teacher, whatever capacity that teaching might be done in or outside of the classroom? But for how many of you was that incident's motivation to say, I ain't doing that, right? So critical incidences do not always have to be, and often are not, positive developments. But they are also things, our teaching and learning stories and the incidences, the hinge moments, we might say. Those are things that shape our assumptions, our answers to questions like these, right? Whether we know it or not, whether we admit it or not, or whether we would answer this in the ways that are actually accurate, right? When we walk into a classroom, when we enter a teaching and learning space, we have assumptions about what excellent and effective learning look like. We have assumptions about the best way, or at least the optimal way in a particular situation to teach, or to work interpersonally with students, or what should happen in these spaces. We have assumptions that explain for us why students struggle, either academically or otherwise. Our stories give us answers to these questions, and those answers in turn shape the way that we operate on a daily, quotidian, routine basis. So the boring stuff that we do, like writing syllabi, right, or creating an assignment prompt, or planning for a discussion. I mean, I'm not saying it's always boring, but that kind of everyday sort of mechanical stuff that we do, those are guided by assumptions, right? It's like the this is water story, right? Like, how does a fish describe water? How do you describe what you're in all the time? And so let me give you one example of how incidences that happen decisively shape, even despite our efforts in some cases, answers to some of these questions. That's me. Well, not all of me. One of the more important parts of me, though. On January 21st, 2024. And if you know anything about brains, that blank spot is what the doctors call bad. I had a stroke. I lost the ability to speak. Temporarily, of course. I was lucky. I got very quick care. The big stroke actually happened in the emergency room, which was convenient. I mean, I'm not recommending that you have a stroke, like 0 out of 10, do not recommend. But if you're gonna have one, be in the emergency room, right? Super convenient. So I was very fortunate to be able to get a surgical intervention that, ensured that my recovery, at least as I thought, would be relatively quick and mostly complete. And so when I got out of ICU, there were a couple of weeks where if you have a stroke, you're like super, super tired. And so the fatigue was there, and I didn't really realize kind of what was happening. But what I did start to realize, there were two things. One, turned out I had balance problems. And I found this out because when I returned to work about 4 or 6 weeks later, I was walking down the hall and I turned my head too quickly to the right and went down, which, suboptimal. But what I also found, and what I continue to experience, are real problems with my short-term memory, which was not an issue for me before. I'm a historian, right? We do memorizing. And so there would be times where someone would say something to me, where it was like someone on ice without ice skates, right? It would just slide right out of my head instantly. Which, if you're in a meeting with academic administrators, for example, and you get asked a question about a point that was just discussed, that's not great. And what I found myself doing was not talking, was withdrawing, was spending all my time writing. I was trying to transcribe, like the eager student who tries to transcribe everything we say in their notes, thinking that's the best note-taking strategy, right? I was doing that because I was so scared that I would forget literally what my provost said next to me 30 seconds before, because that had already happened. And someone commented on that. They said, normally you're not quiet, which was a charitable way of putting it, but now you are. Is everything okay? I was like, honestly, no. Right? I struggle to remember names. I have to take notes in a lot of weird ways that I'm not used to before. I carry a notebook with me to jot things down so I don't forget. I set an alarm on my watch when I'm supposed to meet somebody. And there are times when that alarm's gone off and I have no idea why. And so when I encounter students in classes now, because I teach a first-year seminar course, who are reluctant to participate in class, what I realized is that even though I would consider myself very pro-student, very compassionate, very flexible, very understanding, I was carrying an assumption with me that students who did not engage in class were just disconnected. Whatever the reasons for that might have been, they were checked out. And that was not good, right? That was negative. Even in a period where, again, I intellectually understand that speaking up in class is not everybody's jam, but the assumptions I was operating on were, why aren't you talking? You must not be engaged. You must not have prepared. You aren't ready for this. And the reason that I understood that was the assumption I was operating under was because I couldn't participate in other discussions, and I knew that it wasn't because I didn't want to. That was a critical incident. those were the assumptions that I was carrying into a class without realizing it. Please do not have a major medical crisis to unearth some of your teaching and learning assumptions. But that's the kind of stuff that happens when we do this work, right? I was sort of horrified to discern that those were the assumptions I was operating under, because if you had asked me, how do you respond to students that aren't participating in a discussion or seem to be engaged in class, my faculty developer self would have given you a whole range of strategies to think about, and I would have prefaced it by saying, don't assume that you know why students aren't participating. And yet. So critically reflective practice then is something that helps us foster student success, and foster student success holistically. In other words, not just based on things like content retention or grade point average or performance on high stakes assessments or licensure exams, holistic student success. Students show up not just as their cognitive selves, but as their affective selves. Learning is both cognitive and affective. And again, we say we understand this, right? But in practice, when we design our courses, and I'm using we both very generally, but also very intentionally in the first person, right? When we design our courses and learning experience, we default to a primarily content-centric model, like we're teaching brains on sticks, as opposed to actual human beings. How do we figure that out and change it? So another invitation to reflect. So I use the word here. Many of you are literally here at William and Mary, but if you are at another institution, just substitute your own institution there. Make a list. What are the specific things that your students at your place need to have or need to do to be successful? See how many items you could come up with on your list. So as you look at what you've written down, and again, with the understanding that there's probably more, given more time to think and reflect, where does this show up? Maybe it shows up in some places. Maybe some of the things on your list appear in the way that you introduce a course or the way that you frame a syllabus or your syllabus language. But these are atomized efforts. And so students' understanding of what it takes to be successful or the things that they might need, if those things get surfaced for students, it is often in spite of rather than because of the way that we're communicating with them about their success. So this is a really interesting exercise to do with, say, your department or unit. What does a student need to succeed as a history major? Are we telling them that? If so, where? How many times? In a medium that they actually read? Or in a way that's compelling? How many of you do the sort of exercise where you have a class where you have your students at the end of the semester sort of write a letter to the next semester students, like, here's what you need to be successful. Does anybody do that? Highly recommend that. It is great. I can talk all the time to students about what it takes to be successful, but that peer voice from people who've actually done the thing is so much more compelling than anything I can say. If you do something like that, or if you decide to engage in an activity like that, have your students go through this exercise. What does it take to be successful in this class, and where did I see this or hear this? Right? And that's also great assessment data for us, by the way. It helps us surface our practices. Think about the hidden curriculum, then, because it often, what will come out of a discussion like that, whether it's with peers or with students, is oftentimes a discussion of what we would call the hidden curriculum, right? So a phrase is probably familiar to a bunch of you in here, but if not, hidden curriculum is the stuff that we're teaching students that is not the formal curriculum, right? It's not the learning outcomes, it's not the course materials, it's not the assessments on the syllabus, but it's stuff they're learning perhaps as, if not more powerfully than the formal curriculum. Our entire campus, virtual and physical spaces, is a teaching and learning space. Students are learning in the classroom, they're learning online, but they're also learning in the parking lot, the dining hall, the registrar's office, the financial aid office, their dorms, the quad. What are they learning? Because we are teaching them, whether we realize it or not. So another question to reflect on as we do our work then, in my class and radiating outwards through the institution, where is the hidden curriculum doing its work? This is also a really good, interesting, but you have to do it in a place where you've created trust, discussion to have with students. Introducing the concept of a hidden curriculum and asking them, what's the hidden curriculum here? Where do you see it work? What is it doing? What kind of work is it doing? Because we need to know as instructors. We talk a lot about student motivation, but sometimes the best way to really understand a concept and the way that it's working is to think about its opposite first. And so in the same way we might think of hopelessness as a way to think about hope, so too can we think about demotivators. Right? So think back to the critical incidences that you identified. They could have been demotivators. Maybe they were, right? Sometimes when doors shut in front of us, we're like, F it, I'll go to another door, right? But that was still a door that closed. That is still a path we could not or did not take. Right? What demotivates? Because then we can think intentionally about what motivates our students. In an age of, and I hate to say it because I know we're all kind of tired of hearing about it, but artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, we think a lot about what is motivating students to actually do this work themselves, right? In ways that we want them to be able to go through a process, which is where the learning occurs in many cases, right? How do we motivate them to do that, right? How do we foster intrinsic motivation, which is a key to sort of untying the knot of academic integrity in an age of AI. We need to really think and be able to answer those questions. Is anyone familiar with control value theory? All right, so Reinhard Beckmann, an educational and developmental psychologist, framed this idea, which I think is really helpful to think about student motivation, and in particular, intrinsic motivation. And I should also point out, I linked a number of sources in here, and I'm going to make a link to these slides available to Adam so you can put it on the resource hub as well. But control value theory posits that when a learner enters the learning space, they conduct sort of an appraisal, right? An environmental scan, if you will. And they're looking for two things. What can I control? And where or what is the value? Now, not control in, I'm going to seize the curriculum and teach the class how I wish, right? That's what state legislatures do. What can I control in terms of my agency, right? Do the things that I do shape the outcomes that I experience, right? What can I control? Where is my agency? And then what is the value? Not just what am I learning content-wise, because we know, right? Students don't retain much content at all after a course is done. In fact, virtually none of it within a year. Which, confronted with that fact, and if you've not heard that before, you're probably like, what am I doing, right? You can face an existential crisis, or we can, what is learning really, right? And so what are the things that students are getting in this experience? How are they changing, right? Because courses change students. What are the changes, and how do they realize that that's happening? Do we have the chance to have them check in and see that process occurring, right? That's control value theory. And so again, our goal is when students enter an environment and conduct this appraisal, if they sense a high degree of control and a high degree of value, Beckmann posits, then that activates a positive emotional framework, positive affective framework, which can help shape things like motivation. Motivation is an emotion. Motivation is affective in many ways. And so here I'm drawing on the work of Sarah Rose Kavanaugh, who wrote a really good book called The Spark of Learning, about the role that emotions play in learning and student success, which was a revelatory book to me. So highly recommend it. Above all, students want us to know and they want us to value their stories. Students want to be seen, just as we do, as the full and complicated human beings that they are. Students need to know that they are here in our classroom, in our institutions, on our campus, not in spite of, but because of who they are, and all of the complexity and sometimes messiness that involves. We cannot foster a climate of intrinsic motivation if we don't know our students' stories and if we don't value those stories. And so giving our students a chance to tell those stories, maybe thinking about critical incidents as they're in their journey as learners, is one way to start doing that work. So, give you an invitation to reflect for a couple more minutes then. So I'm going to use Peckering's control value construct. It's not the only way to talk about motivation, but I found it a really useful framework to keep me thinking about, again, control and value, agency and motivation. In the courses that you teach, or in the ways that you work with students, if your role is primarily outside of a classroom, you're still teaching, right? And so where do the students with whom you work see a sense of control? So think on that for a minute. If your experience right now is anything like mine, the first time I was introduced to this concept and asked questions similar to this, you might find yourself writing a bunch of things like, yes, this is where students see agency, this is where students see value. And then you look at the list and you're like, ooh, do they really see that? Or is that stuff that I think they should see that maybe they don't, right? What have I not surfaced? What have I not been transparent enough? What have I not been explicit enough in terms of foregrounding for my students? We often fall back on what I call the eat your vegetables defense, right? If any of you have raised kids, I have 2 kids, eat your vegetables because they're good for you is not very compelling logic to anybody, right? And so we can't say higher education is good for you and just assume that that's going to do the work that we need it to do, right? So how do we help our students find the value, right? Because if we know there's value, and if and I would assume that we do because we're here trying to think about the work we do to increase that value for students, right? If we know there's value, how do we help our students see it in the ways that we might articulate it to? So are there occasions when our pedagogies ask students to turn inward in a contemplative fashion, if you will, and discern, to think about, to even name, which they might not have been asked to do prior to this, right? Their relationship to their learning. So again, back to this idea of what is your story, right? What are the critical incidents? You as a learner, what choices have you made or not made? What strategies have you adopted or not adopted? What barriers have you faced as a learner? And how did you overcome those barriers? Did you overcome those barriers? What helps you learn? How do you learn best? What are some ways in which you don't have experience in learning? What might be the outcomes of trying something new? Is it safe to take a risk to be vulnerable in this space? It's this type of work, metacognitive work, learning how to learn. And not just for first-year students. Normally this gets sort of isolated in new student seminar classes, right? And the assumption is that after first semester of their first year, they've taken new student seminar, and now they are metacognitive. Bueno, let's jump into the content. That's not how it works. If we hang our hat on covering content as the lasting outcomes of our course, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. Metacognition and reflection. Regular, often, and intentional, formal and informal, thinking about process and all of its glorious messiness in some cases. That is where meaningful and lasting learning takes place. Do we give our students the opportunity to be in those spaces enough? Do we give our students the opportunity to be in those spaces at all? Do we give ourselves the opportunity to be in those spaces? Do we model this for our students? So one more invitation to reflect, and then I'll offer some sort of closing thoughts and a challenge. So if we go back to this idea of an ethic of hope being foundationally planted on agency and pathways, where is your agency? Where does it show up? What are the spaces and places? What are the conversations and the initiatives around you in the micro and macro scale where you have agency? If you find yourself in a position of seniority or of academic leadership, or if you look like me, i.e. tenured white dude, your agency may lie in helping others or giving shield to others to have them connect with their agency and operate. So your agency isn't just something that is inward focused. Where is your agency? And again, these are questions that are worth lingering over and thinking about. My intent is to sort of put them in front of you, give you the opportunity to return to these as well. Where are the pathways that you can or perhaps should deploy that agency? Where do you put your power? Because that's what agency often is, right? Where do you put your power to work? Where should you? What should you start doing? What might you stop doing? What might you be doing that you wish to continue doing if you think about it in this framework? Agency and pathways. Help your students find their agency and pathways as well. Students, like us, need to be working from a position of hope. Hopeless students do not learn. And many students come to us already having been told or shaped an academic story about themselves. Most often it's been shaped for them though, where they say, I will not succeed in this class. Any mathematicians in here? Math anxiety is a thing. Many students come to us in particular in 100 level and developmental math courses already having decided they're not going to be successful. Hopeless students do not learn. Our job is to help them connect with the agency and pathways that hopeless becomes hopeful, because then choices and strategies can be made and adopted, and we can come alongside students as partners. And learning is something that they do, not something that is done for them. So the last question that I would ask you, what are you going to do now? This is a picture of the the Paris Commune in 1871. If your next step is to go to the barricades, I'm down. Just to let you know. But it does not have to be this traumatic. Gil Scott Heron has a quote that really resonates with me. He said, the first revolution is when you change your mind.
Change your what?
Change your mind. What are you going to say no to? What is no longer sustainable for you or for others in your community? What are you going to commit to doing next? And maybe that commitment is, I'm going to check out this Freire guy. Maybe that commitment is, I'm going to talk with the colleague next to me at the table because we were vibing when we had that conversation about critical incidents. Maybe that next step is, I am going to sit and intentionally think about these questions in more depth and decide what actions I'm going to take. But write down, if you haven't already, write down that commitment right now. I think there's something powerful in the act of recording intentions. And I already told you I struggle with memory, right? So I record a lot of things, including things that I know that I want to do. But I think there is something important about taking the time to sort of record an intention in a moment of time. Because when we go back to the outside, so to speak, and get back into the hustle and bustle and in the weeds of everything, it can be easy to sort of forget a thought or forget the energy that you were bringing to this thinking. And so recording your commitment is a really useful act. And so I'll leave you with this, again, from Frederick. This resonates for me, I think, more than it ever has. The future does not make us. The future is a possibility space. Not all possibilities are positive. The future can often look bleak. We can give up our agency when we think about how overwhelming possible futures might be. When we give up agency, authoritarians win. Trust me, I'm a historian, that's how it works. The future does not make us. We make ourselves over in the struggle to make the future. We may not know exactly, in fact, we don't have to know exactly what that more just and sustainable future looks like, in its particulars. We just have to start working towards it.